What is happening, everybody? James Hancock here. James Gunn's Superman is right around the corner. It's coming out in a couple days, so I thought it'd be a good time to look back at some of my favorite interpretations of the character over the years, going from 1938 up to the present day, because whether you're talking about the comics or the radio show or the animation or TV or live action or video games or whatever, we've seen a lot of really cool interpretations of the character over the years.
Faster than a speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive, able to leap tall buildings at a single bound. The infant of Krypton is now the Man of Steel, Superman.
And there have been so many writers and so many directors and so many artists and so many amazing actors and animators and game developers who have all left their fingerprints on the character. And on one hand, I like it when people get really fired up about their version of Superman that they want to see on the big screen. But the reality is, making a movie that can satisfy all fans of Superman is challenging. I mean, what people want to see is something that's familiar, but also new and different. And there's part of me that kind of smiles and can sympathize when I see people getting very angry and very defiant about a very specific, narrow interpretation of the character that they love, whether it's from a game or a show or a movie or whatever. It reminds me of going to a comic shop, like in the late 80s or early 90s, before the internet, where you just have a bunch of, antisocial nerds screaming at each other about the correct interpretations of characters. Like, news alert. Nerds have very strong, oftentimes kind of volatile opinions about things that they are passionate about. And I've certainly been guilty of that as well. But luckily with the character of Superman, going back to 1938 till now, there's room in my heart to be open to different styles and influences, and just recognizing that I got very lucky in terms of growing up at a time where we had some really good interpretations of the character in live action, the comics, animation, and I'm going to share those today, but I'm going to try not to overemphasize those versions because there are a lot of versions that came out decades before I was born. Like, if you don't recognize this version of the insignia, stick with me. You'll recognize it in a few short minutes. But there are some great interpretations before I was here on this planet, and there have been some cool interpretations ever since I kind of eased into becoming like a mean old curmudgeon. And I'm going to do my best to give a shout out to all those interpretations today, but I have one rule for this video. I can't share an interpretation of the character unless I've read it, seen it, played it, experienced it firsthand. There are some writers and there's some artists out there that will be neglected by virtue of the fact that I've just not yet had the privilege of getting exposed to this stuff. But the good news is, from 1938 to the present day, I've consumed a hell of a lot of it. And so just leave me a note down in the comments below. Say, hey, so-and-so's art from, Superman 237 to 245, really fucking good. You should totally see that. Like, I'm open to all of it. In preparation for this video, I went back and read a lot of Silver Age Superman comics because I know James Gunn's been very influenced by the Silver Age, and some of that stuff is just absolutely bananas. Those old-fashioned covers by Curt Swan, like when he's introducing characters like Brainiac in the late 50s, they're awesome. And while Krypto wasn't a huge part of the comics when I was a kid, apart from when Alan Moore gave him a very fitting send-off and farewell when he was kind of wrapping up the official continuity of Superman before John Byrne's big reboot. But I have to admit, my favorite part of the trailers has been the inclusion of Krypto. That scene in the latest trailer, and I'm very ambivalent about James Gunn's trailers so far. There are parts that I hate and parts that I love. But when Superman and Krypto are flying into battle side by side and Krypto bites somebody right before Superman knocks his teeth out, it's like, you know what? More of that, please. I'm here for all of it. What I don't like, what I've seen in the trailers, or all the scenes with Superman basically pouting like a teenage boy and losing his temper and like crying and screaming. I'm like, you know what? I grew up with Christopher Reeve, where he was calm and self-assured, and if he got upset, it was for a damn good reason. Like when Lois Lane, spoiler alert if you've not seen Superman the movie from 1978, but when Lois Lane briefly dies at the end of the movie, when Superman's flying up into the screen, screaming and crying, it's well earned. The woman he loves just died, and he's about to, quite literally, turn back the hands of time in order to save her life. I feel like there's room for Superman to lose his shit, but you really got to justify it, and you really got to earn it. But getting back to the Silver Age, I love the fact that James Gunn is one of the few filmmakers out there that really loves comics. Like, when you watch a show or a movie about superheroes written and directed by people who aren't into comics, their shows and movies tend to just feel like mainstream Hollywood product, whether you love it or hate it or disregard it. But when somebody really loves comics, they include certain details where most people are like, what the fuck is that? But comic book lovers are like, yes, Please, like when you briefly see the Watchers in one of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, I'm sure 99% of people out there are like, who are those weird bald dudes? Shame on you. Like, all bald men must unite. But for people who grew up reading Marvel Comics in the 70s and 80s, like, yeah, we love the Watchers. Bring on the Watchers. And I'm hoping that that James Gunn's new movie is going to be littered with as much weird shit from the 1960s and the late 50s as humanly possible. But another reason I'm making this video is that tomorrow is the 4th of July. I hope I can finish editing this and get it out in time for the 4th of July. But nothing screams the 4th of July to me more than Superman. I mean, like, as a little kid watching Superman 2 over and over and over again on HBO, when he flies the flag back to the White House at the end, it gave me chills. And when I looked up the clip earlier today, I was like, I'm getting goosebumps all over again. I do feel patriotism when Superman is leaning into that. And I've often shared this story on this channel, so forgive me for repeating it, but I went to a screening of Superman the movie in LA in the early 2000s, right before the DVD was about to come out. They just fully restored and they were about to re-release it. And I was at the Egyptian Theater, and we get to that incredible scene where Superman and Lois are talking about like the color of her panties and all kinds of crazy shit. You're like, whoa, this was in a Superman movie?
Why are you here? There must be a reason for you to be here.
Yes. I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
You're going to end up fighting every elected official in this country.
Even in LA, a place where people would automatically assume, well, perhaps they might be a little bit more cynical about patriotism and that sort of thing, the theater erupted in applause. People are on their feet, cheering and screaming. Admittedly, these are all Superman nerds. But it was one of the most patriotic moments in my life as like a movie nerd and a comic book nerd. It's like, wow, like these are my people. Even like Superman's villains, like Hank Henshaw, the cyborg Superman. There's a great cover where even he, with like all the metal parts and guns, it's got the American flag. So if a murderous sociopath like Hank Henshaw can get in on the action for July 4th, I feel like we can all set aside our differences and try to embrace a little patriotism here on July 4th. Now, before I wind my clock back to the days of Siegel and Shuster, I'm sure there's some people out there wondering, to what degree is James Hancock a Superman fan? Like, what are your superhero credentials? And I will admit, in the 80s, I was more of a Marvel zombie than a DC freak, but I had an exception for Superman and Batman. There were some really good creators working on those books back then. And, anytime there's a debate about comics, people are immediately going to say, well, show me your long boxes. So here's an image of my long boxes when I was organizing my books, and here's an image of my long boxes all perfectly tucked away. And I was about to start digging out all my old Superman comics, and I realized, you know what, it's going to take me days to get all my old Superman comics. I've got them listed alphabetically and numerically. But between Action Comics and Superman and JLA and Adventure Comics and Superboy and all these different titles, it was going to be quite an undertaking, and it was just going to create a huge fucking mess. But I did pull out a lot of my trade paperbacks that I'm very fond of that feature the character, whether they are specifically Superman books or Justice League of America books, or even in some cases, kind of unusual fetish art by Superman co-creator Joe Shuster. It's not technically a Superman book, but if you like Superman and you like Lois Lane, it's clearly Superman and Lois Lane, but artists got to pay the bills. But I'm enough of a Superman fan where I do have one poster framed in my apartment, Crisis on Infinite Earths #7. And obviously, the comic's not quite this big, but anytime somebody comes to my home and uses the restroom, they must see this iconic moment from DC history with the cover by the great George Pérez, who I did meet at Comic-Con like 10 years ago. But sadly, I do not have a picture with him. I took a picture of him meeting Bill Plimpton, so I have the bragging rights of taking the picture, but I got to shake his hand. But sadly, George Pérez and I did not get a chance to pose for a picture. But if you like Crisis on Infinite Earths, then you can definitely appreciate why I would have that art on my wall. In any case, for the rest of the video, I'm going to try to go more or less sequentially through the history of Superman, but it's tough. Like, if you're talking about an artist like Curt Swan, well, he started working on Superman titles in the late 40s, and he kept working on them until, like, the late 80s. So what I think I'll do, if I get to a creator where they have a long history with the character, I'll just stick with them through all my favorite beats, but it'll be like a little bit like ironing a shirt, where you kind of go forward and then go back, and you iron a little further, and then you go back. And when we get to some periods like the mid-'80s and the mid-'90s, there were so many different things going on at the same time, it's impossible to stay totally sequential. But I'm going to do the best that I can, but I'll include time codes down below. So if you just want to hear about Grant Morrison, or you just want to hear about Alan Moore, or you just want to hear about Challenge of the Superfriends, like, you'll be able to find those areas pretty quickly. But before beginning our history lesson, I want to say one last thing about getting the character of Superman right, whatever that means, because even if you love a specific interpretation of the character from a particular period, there's no one version of Superman. There's Superman that the world sees. There's the version of Clark Kent that the world sees, and there's the version of either Supes or Kal-El or Clark that people see in private, the people who know all of his various secrets. Like the version of Clark and or Kal-El that Batman sees or that Lois Lane sees or any of his close friends see is quite different from the version that the public sees. And so a great period of Superman or a great adaptation of Superman tends to get all three of those different personas perfect, like Richard Donner and Superman the movie in 1978. Whether Superman's saving Lois as she falls from a helicopter or interacting at the Daily Planet as Clark Kent and acting, clumsy and befuddled and confused and that sort of thing and asking to have half his paycheck sent home to his mother, or if he's alone with Lois about to divulge his secret and kind of standing up straight before realizing, not the moment's not quite right. That's a version where they got all three versions of the character absolutely correct. But my hope is that over the course of this video, you'll see so many different cool interpretations of the character that you'll come to understand that there are a variety of ways to kind of crack that nut. But let's start with Action Comics #1, 1938, a period where I'm probably the least familiar with the character. I've read a few standalone issues. It is cool seeing Superman, the earliest version of his costume, and back when he was just leaping as opposed to flying, and he was considerably less powerful back then. But there is a cool kind of old school rustic charm to reading comics from the late 30s. And just to give you an idea of how quickly he became a popular character, I mean, the comic industry today would drool to get these kinds of sales figures, but in January of 1939, only a few months after the debut of the character, you had Action Comics, Adventure Comics, Detective Comics, and More Fun Comics, all of which featured Superman in various capacities, that sold a combined 709,879 copies just in January of 1939. And by early 1941, when you started seeing additional books featuring the character, that figure rose to over 2 million. So you were selling them, admittedly, they were selling them for, a few cents back then, but if you're selling 2 million copies a month featuring a character, yeah, he's a really insanely popular character, which immediately leads into radio shows and animation and eventually TV shows, etc. and so forth. But I don't want to dismiss the 40s entirely, because in the 40s you get so many just weird, bizarre covers. Like one of my favorites is World's Finest Comics from number 33 from 1948. People always talk about what is like the best way to tackle Marvel or DC, but it's like if you want to be quote unquote true to the comics, Superman juggling Batman and Robin, that is technically true to the comics. But the character Superman grew so popular that he very quickly leaped from the pages of the comics into radio and animation and what I'm going to just call the Bud Collyer era. And I'm not sure if I'm saying his last name correctly, but Bud Collyer voiced Superman and Clark in the radio serial, as well as in the Fleischer Brothers animated series. And the radio show officially came first. It aired from 1940 to 1951. And the episode that I heard for the first time in preparation for this video is the very first episode, The Baby from Krypton, February 12th, 1940, where Jor-El is breaking the bad news to his fellow Kryptonians.
The sun is gradually drawing Krypton closer to it. Within a month, possibly only a week, the gravitational pull will be so tremendous that Krypton will not be able to weather the strain.
And if you like old school radio shows, whether it's like old Mercury Theater with Orson Welles or whatever the case might be, it is so fucking cool hearing like a full-blown radio show with like good production value, good music, a good intro, and really good talented actors doing their thing. And it's also interesting seeing slightly different variations on the traditional Kryptonian lore, because in the context of this radio show, all Kryptonians are already strong as hell. Baby Kal-El's parents acknowledge that they're already capable of incredible feats of strength that'll give their baby natural advantages when he arrives on Earth. But Bud Collyer continued to play Superman into 1946. But another actor I have to mention is Jackson Beck, who from 1943 to 1950 would do that well-known signature opening, one of the most famous in radio history. So all the building blocks of the Legend of Superman were being put into place. But in the 1940s, there's one interpretation of the character which I think leaves every other interpretation completely in its dust. And that is the animated series created by Fleischer Studios. Max and Dave Fleischer were two of the best animators in the 1930s, and they were ready and eager to tackle The Man of Steel. And some of these early short films are some of the best animated shorts that I've ever seen. And I should specify that Fleischer Studios did the first 8 short films, and then in 1942, Famous Studios did the remaining shorts up through 1943. And luckily, these shorts are really easy to find. But what kills me is when people post them online and the wrong aspect ratio. Back in 1941 and 1942, the great majority of movies were in the classic Academy ratio, or 4:3, or 1.33 to 1. And when you post these shorts in 1.85 to 1 and stretch them out, it makes everybody look fat and weird. And it's just, when an artist makes something incredible, like these animated shorts, just post them in the original format in which they were made. But my favorites of these are probably just the first 5. I think the first 5 is when they were really putting their best foot forward. But the original Superman, followed by the Mechanical Monsters, I think that one's my favorite. $1 Billion Limited is incredible. The Arctic Giant is incredible. If you loved watching Superman fight the kaiju in the trailer for the new Superman movie by James Gunn, the Arctic Giant will absolutely tickle you. And the Bulleteers is really good as well. So if you love those, obviously you're going to watch the rest. And I discovered these back in college. I had a VHS cassette that had all of them, and I would just get super baked, and I would watch them all in a row and then start it over and do it again. But it's those first couple where you could argue perhaps that they're a little formulaic. Usually Lois Lane goes out on a job, and because she's very ambitious, gets into trouble, and she's just like, it doesn't matter if it's a yawning volcano with lava coming out. She's going in to get her story, and then Superman or Clark will hear the Daily Planet, the bad news, and he'll say,
"This looks like a job for Superman."
But what's cool about these early shorts is that they really nail an aspect of Superman, which I think, when we're talking about the ingredients that make Superman like my Superman, you have to show Superman when he's being graceful. And only a handful of artists and animators and filmmakers have really nailed this aspect of his character. But whether he's floating or moving or leaping, like he should be as graceful as a ballet dancer, but with the strength of like the Incredible Hulk, which is hard to do, where the contrast of the incredible power and the incredible grace makes Superman. And the animated short films from the early 40s really nailed that aspect. And you see that periodically where certain people recognize, all right, when Superman's doing something, it needs to be as smooth as silk, just totally effortless, before he then shows Herculean effort. I think that's a detail that sometimes people overlook or miss in some of their later interpretations of the character. In any case, here we are more than 80 years later, and these animated shorts I think are still a strong contender for the best interpretation of the character that we've ever seen. And now for all of you people out there who don't know which version of the insignia I'm wearing, the answer should be abundantly clear. But as we get into the late 40s, that's where we start seeing a lot of legends like Curt Swan beginning to emerge. And Curt Swan, I think his best stuff is probably like late 50s, early 60s. Although in 1986, when he was working with Alan Moore, he was still awesome. I mean, his last issue of on the character of Superman was Action Comics Volume 1, issue 583 in 1986. And clearly he could have stuck with the character for much longer, but they wanted John Byrne to do a complete and total company-wide kind of reboot of the character at that time. But throughout the 1950s, I think the most popular version of Superman had to be the TV show, The Adventures of Superman.
Look, up in the sky, it's a bird.
It's a plane!
It's Superman.
Which started on September 19th, 1952, and ended on April 28th, 1958. And I would catch it here and there, like in bits and pieces, at my grandparents' home when I was a little kid. My grandfather was, he was, I'm a TV addict, and he always had the TV going at all times. And periodically, those old black and white Superman episodes would come on. Although the last couple seasons were done in color, but I must admit that I very rarely would watch these episodes in their entirety over the last couple decades. But for this video, I just went on a few sites and I was like, what is the best episode of The Adventures of Superman that ever aired? And it seems like the general consensus is Season 2, Episode 12, Panic in the Sky. And it's fantastic. And part of my enjoyment is just the unintentional comedy of fitness standards in the 1950s, where a guy like in his early 40s with like shoulder pads under his costume could pass as a big muscle-bound badass. But George Reeve sadly died at age 45 in 1959. Some say suicide, some say murder. Other people who are much more familiar with the story of George Reeves will have to tell me. But he does get the gravitas of Superman, and he's good as Clark Kent. But this episode, you basically have this giant asteroid that's coming to Earth. He flies out into space to knock it off its course. even though it might kill him, but of course he's Superman. He doesn't care. He's got to save everybody. But when he hits it and saves everybody, he gets amnesia. So we get an episode where both Clark and Superman are kind of clueless as to who they are, and then slowly but surely they remember who they truly are. But the show had a great intro, had some great episodes. Other people out there might disagree about what's the best episode, but I was like, you know what? I can't do this video and not at least give a shout out to the great George Reeves, where I might be more of a Christopher Reeve guy than a George Reeves guy, but anyway, you cannot deny his contributions to the character. And I should also add that around this time, you get a lot more people starting to satirize and poke fun at the character, most notably in the story of Super Duper Man by Harvey Kurtzman and Wally Wood. And Wally Wood's one of my all-time favorite comic book artists, and Harvey Kurtzman was a great humorist. But sometimes when I'm discussing Superman, I'll just kind of casually refer to him as Super Duper Man, and people might be like, "What? Why are you saying it that way?" I read a reprint in the 1980s, but originally issue number 4 of Mad Magazine, the April-May issue from 1953, is when we first saw the story of Super Duper Man, and 70 years later, it's still pretty fucking funny. But it's time to stop fucking around, and it's time to get into the Silver Age of comics, what a lot of people would argue is the greatest age of comics. And for most comic book historians, the Silver Age lasts from 1956 to 1970, and it basically starts with the new version of The Flash and Showcase number 4 in 1956. But in the early 50s, superheroes were kind of falling out of fashion, which we can relate to in 2025. But horror comics and romance comics and war comics and Western, like every kind of comic you can imagine, every kind of genre imaginable was thriving and flourishing, but superheroes had gotten a little stale and out of date. But in the Silver Age, they made a massive comeback, especially at DC. And what I love about the Silver Age is just how fucking weird it was. Like, some people might think that the Silver Age is a little squeaky clean and a little square, but like they were letting their imaginations run wild. And if you just do a quick search, like best Silver Age covers of The Flash that are really weird, you can spend hours just looking at the covers and just laughing hysterically. But it's just great seeing how there were no rules about what was like established canon or the official kind of boundaries of what was acceptable for superhero storytelling. They would let their imaginations go wherever the hell they liked. And you get some really, really cool stuff. And I already mentioned earlier, one of my favorites is Action Comics Volume 1, 242, with a cover by the great Curt Swan. And this is actually the first appearance by Brainiac in the Bottle City of Kandor. And I feel like that is a Superman movie that is screaming to be made. I feel like we've seen versions of Brainiac in animation and in video games that are excellent, but we've never seen a great Brainiac movie. And just the idea of the Bottle City of Kandor, this is when we get some of the coolest ideas for Superman in the late 50s and early 60s, like having a big giant golden key for unlocking the Fortress of Solitude and all these crazy things that people just love and adore now. But the idea that there is a city, a Kryptonian city out there, where you could have an entire movie where Superman would be interacting with Kryptonians and interacting with his own culture while a captive of one of his most terrifying villains. That is a movie screaming to be made. But until then, we can use Action Comics 242 as a placeholder from 1958. But if you like the character of Superman, what was great about the Silver Age is that he was everywhere. He was in the pages of Superman. He was in the pages of Action Comics. He was in the pages of Superman's pal, Jimmy Olsen. He was in the pages of Adventure Comics, which slowly introduced the Legion of Superheroes. He was in World's Finest Comics. He was in Superboy. He was in Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane. And of course, he was in the Justice League of America. And I've got some early issues of Justice League, or JLA as it was known back then, right here. And in the earliest issues of JLA, back when it was just appearing in Brave and the Bold, Superman wasn't necessarily front and center. It was much more concerned with Flash, Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, Martian Manhunter, and Aquaman. But Batman and Superman were so huge, they were kind of considered like VIP. But obviously, Superman's always been a huge part of the JLA. In any era, it's hard to have a really good run of the JLA in the absence of Superman, apart from the Giffen, DeMatteis, Maguire run of the late 80s when it became Justice League International, where Superman was barely in it. And that might be my favorite run of the JLA. In any case, I hope that James Gunn will very successfully reintroduce some of the characters and concepts from Silver Age Superman. But if you want to basically get like a snapshot of all the best characters and storylines and just ideas from the Silver Age, pick up Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow by Alan Moore, where he basically had 2 issues to wrap up all the classic continuity. Right before John Byrne did his big reboot in the 1980s, Alan Moore was given the chance to basically wrap up all the dangling storylines and give classic Superman a proper send-off. And this little collection It includes Superman 423 and Action Comics 583, both of which were published in June of 1986. But if you've never read any Silver Age Superman, if you just read those 2 issues, you'll be like, oh, all right, these are the main villains and the main pals and the main kind of allies that Superman had at that time. And so Alan Moore very quickly and very economically found a way to give a send-off to all those characters and all those storylines, and it fucking rules. And it's actually kind of sad and kind of moving. Like, it looks simple on the surface, but it packs a major punch. But we'll get there in a little while when we tackle the mid-'80s. But we can't leave the Silver Age behind without tipping our hat to the great Neal Adams, who kind of straddles the divide of the Silver Age and the Bronze Age. And a lot of people attribute his Green Lantern, Green Arrow team-up that he did with Denny O'Neil in 1970 as the beginning of the Bronze Age. A lot of people disagree about when the Bronze Age officially begins, but Neal Adams was doing covers and issues for DC in the late 60s. A lot of Batman, a lot of Superman, and I think his first encounter with the character of Superman, it might be open to debate, but I'm seeing here Action Comics 356 in 1967, in the same month as Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane, number 79 from 1967. But throughout the 1970s, he gave us so many incredible images, like Superman 252 from 1972. It's one of the most iconic images of Superman that I can possibly imagine. And I like how Neal Adams made his characters very, like, he gave them very long limbs and made them appear very graceful. Like, you can very easily imagine Superman moving about very gracefully in the sky when he's rendered by Neal Adams. And I actually met Neal Adams. R.I.P. Neal Adams, but I met him in the summer of 2016, and sadly in this picture we're promoting Batman, not Superman, but I didn't know I was going to be making this video 9 years ago when I met him. But probably the most famous example of Neal Adams working on the character of Superman would be Superman versus Muhammad Ali back in 1978. The story is by Denny O'Neil, but it also had contributions by Neal Adams, Dick Giordano, a figure who's more of an editor and kind of an inker, but his name doesn't get mentioned nearly enough in the history of comics. And we also had background inks by Terry Austin, but that's one of those big kind of marquee, just like, I don't know, just iconic moments in comic book history where you had a lot of legends all working on this same issue. And they found a way, I haven't read it in a while, but they found an interesting way to kind of depower Superman to make it, more of an even fight when he's fighting Muhammad Ali. But if you like Bronze Age comics, holy shit, you definitely got to check it out. And I'm very partial to Bronze Age comics, but there's some debate about what's the official beginning and end. But it seems like a lot of people will say that the death of Gwen Stacy over Marvel Comics was the beginning of the Bronze Age, because comics had to kind of grow up. But basically from like 1970 to the mid-'80s was the Bronze Age. And a lot of people feel like the Crisis on Infinite Earths was the official end of the Bronze Age. But in whatever era you are a child and first discover these characters, naturally you're going to get very sentimental and attached to those interpretations of the character. But one of the best artists from this period, where whether you bought a lunchbox or a t-shirt, like anytime you saw like any sort of DC advertising in the 1970s or early 80s, there was a very good chance the art was by José Luis García-López, and he's awesome. And it's hard to find like great Lopez runs or García-López runs where it's like, oh, here's 50 issues in a row of just his work. I first discovered him through the comic called DC Comics Presents, which was launched in 1978. And one of the very first Superman comics I ever owned was part of that series, but he'd already moved on as an artist. But if you love the 70s and the early 80s, yeah, I like leaning into my Spanish pronunciation, but José Luis García-López is a true legend, and he got some of the best praise imaginable from the legendary Julius Schwartz, arguably one of the best editors who ever worked at DC. But Julius Schwartz kept hiring him because he said he can draw anything. And I feel like if you are somebody making a living drawing for comics or for movie posters or whatever, if one of the bosses who's hiring people says, oh, they can draw anything, well then I cannot think of higher praise. But we've now come to the part of the video where I'm actually alive and experiencing these stories firsthand as they come out, which brings me full circle to Challenge of the Super Friends, which, goddamn, when I was a little squirt watching it like on reruns on TV, it was just, 20 minutes of pure glee and joy and euphoria every time. But I was always confused because sometimes they'd show earlier episodes of the Super Friends, which was a little bit more innocent, kind of geared more towards toddlers. And then sometimes we'd see them fighting the Legion of Doom. And I always knew when we saw the intro, if we saw this big lineup of the Justice League, and then we saw the Legion of Doom, I was like, yes, this is one of the good ones. These are the ones that I like. But it wasn't until the early 2000s where I got the Challenge of the Super Friends on DVD, where I could just watch just those 16 episodes without having to watch the other episodes of the Super Friends. But hang on, I've got all the stats right here. Boom, 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 boom. So the show was created by Julius Schwartz, Gardner Fox, a big JLA writer, and Mike Sekowsky, and it was the third series of Super Friends cartoons, because you had Super Friends in 1973 and the all-new Super Friends Hour in 1977, but in 1978, from September 9th to December 23rd, we had Challenge of the Super Friends, which actually leads us right up to probably the biggest moment in the history of the character, the release of Superman the movie. But let's stay on the animation for a second, because I feel like there's an individual who sometimes gets overlooked in the conversations about the greatest Supermen of all time, because Danny Dark, he voiced Superman from 1973 to 1985, and for a generation of kids watching these animated shows on TV, like he's probably was your first Superman, like up and away, or great Scott. I mean, like the way he would deliver his lines, he's awesome. Like he was absolutely incredible. And we've had so many different incredible actors voicing the character over the years, but I love Danny Dark and what he did with the character, and I feel like sometimes he just sadly gets overlooked, but he died back in 2004, but he gave me a lot of joy back in the day. But if you wanted to see an episode of Challenge of the Super Friends that I really recommend, there's one called Secret Origins of the Super Friends from October 28th, 1978, the day my little sister was born. But that is an absolutely fantastic episode. But yeah, just watch the entire 16-episode run, and you'll have an absolute blast. But the show ended in December of that year, right when Superman the movie was coming out on December 15th, 1978. So we're going to have to pause for a second and slow down, because this is a big moment in the history of Super Duperman. And in a few years, I'll definitely do a big 50th anniversary video where I'll probably spend 2 hours breaking down all the little details and the behind the scenes. But I think what makes this movie so legendary is that you've got incredible technicians and craftspeople and creators in so many different areas working on so many different aspects of the movie, whether it's writers like Mario Puzo, or a director like Richard Donner coming off the success of The Omen, or John Williams coming off the success of Star Wars, or Jeffrey Unsworth, one of the greatest DPs who's ever gotten behind a movie camera. You know, all these incredible creators. But then, of course, you've got Christopher Reeve.
Who are you?
A friend.
Nobody will ever replace Christopher Reeve, because Christopher Reeve shouldn't have even been possible in 1978. When you hear about some of the actors that were being considered to play Superman, when they're talking about people like Paul Newman, you're like, what? Paul Newman? Like, he doesn't look like Superman. Like, I love him in like a million other movies, but not Paul Newman. But there were so many incredible actors back then who just could not like pull off being Superman. And also, you needed to find a great Lex Luthor. You needed to find a great Lois Lane. You needed to find a great person for all the roles. You needed to find a great General Zod, or you needed a great Jor-El. And they just got this Hall of Fame cast together where it's like every single actor that they picked for this movie is like, oh, you are perfect. Like, nobody will ever play that role better. Doesn't matter how small the character is. Every single person that was hired to be in this movie, down to Ned Beatty, you're like, wow, like, I can't imagine any other actor alive playing this role. And I feel the exact same way about Christopher Reeve, because he can do wholesome and all-American and noble and reliable without being hokey or cheesy. And I think a lot of actors have a hard time delivering that kind of dialogue without kind of winking, like, oh, we know this is kind of silly, but we don't really mean it because we live in cynical times. Christopher Reeve makes you believe, and I think that's the real secret. Can you make the audience believe? And as I was rewatching the movie a couple days ago, I couldn't believe how many dirty jokes were kind of littered throughout this movie, because you have Jackie Cooper as Perry White, who is the greatest Perry White that we will ever see.
There's only one P in rapist. Lois Lane, say hello to Clark Kent.
Hold you one P.
I think sometimes people overlook just how incredible he is in the movie, because he's surrounded by so many other actors that are just so fantastic. But his ongoing exchange with Lois Lane, because Lois Lane, while a great reporter, she's got a small issue with spelling, but he'll say things like, there's only one P in rapist, or there's no T in brassiere. It's like, why are y'all talking about rapists and brassieres? But there is an adult component to this movie that somehow doesn't clash with the incredibly wholesome, noble tone of what Christopher Reeve is bringing to the table. And
Sure you don't really mean that, Lois?
I don't believe this.
Lois?
I never lie.
And I think it just boils down to the fact that Christopher Reeve is very polite. Superman needs to be polite. Like when he's coming out of the building to save Lois Lane, and he sees this guy who's reacting to his outfit, and he just says, "Excuse me," before flying up. The way he says "excuse me," it's polite.
Hey, Jim! Whoa!
Excuse me.
That's a bad outfit!
Or when he saves a cat for a little girl, he's polite. but also he can be the world's biggest dork. And when I'd say he's a rival to Cary Grant as Cary Grant in Clark Kent mode. He's very reminiscent of Cary Grant in Bringing Up Baby, where he plays kind of a dorky professor, and that movie's hilarious, but I know Christopher Reeve was a big fan of Cary Grant. But when he's saying things to Lois like, let's push off, shall we? I mean, he's leaning into being such a goober and just totally selling it every step of the way. Or he saves Lois Lane from a bullet and then pretends like he's fainted. And he just, because he's willing to let people make fun of him and kind of push him around and talk down to him, but we always get to see him kind of smiling to himself because he's got that incredible internal confidence where it doesn't matter what anybody says or thinks about Clark Kent, because in his mind he knows he's Kal-El, and he's here on behalf of his father to help these people achieve their full potential. As Jor-El says, they could be a great people, Kal-El, they wish to be. It's just bone-chilling. And what's staggering about this movie all these decades later is like the scenes on Krypton are like the most otherworldly, kick-ass sci-fi you can possibly imagine. Like the John Williams score as they're pushing in on that big giant dome where the trial of General Zod is taking place. Like all that stuff is awesome. And Superman's nowhere in sight. It's just Terrence Stamp and Marlon Brando doing their thing. I love all that. And then we get the parts in Smallville, which is as Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell would be jealous of those scenes. I don't know if you ever had a chance to see them or not. I don't even know when Norman Rockwell died, but that is Rockwellian as it gets, and it's absolutely incredible. But it's like its own little movie. And then when you finally cut to Metropolis, which is basically just New York in the late 70s, and it's one of the great New York movies, it's like, how many different movies are we going to get to see? But like, you don't see Superman in the suit until 47 minutes into the movie. That is just uncanny. I mean, like if you tried to release a movie today where the superhero does not appear in costume until 47 minutes in, I mean, people would revolt. They would react. I mean, in any case, because this movie is so fascinating in Krypton and in Smallville, which are the key components of who this character is, we just kind of overlook the fact that Superman doesn't really show up until pretty deep into the movie. But just so I don't come across as somebody who's totally blind to the flaws of the movie, I'll concede two flaws when it comes to Superman the movie. The scene of Clark running alongside the train, even when I saw it on TV for the first time as a little kid, I was like, yeah, it's kind of goofy looking the way he's running. And the internal poem by Lois Lane when they're flying along in the sky, it's kind of cheesy. I feel like Christopher Reeve can do cheesy very well, but that poem is dreadful. But the beautiful thing is, we didn't just have Superman the movie, we also had Superman 2. And I love the Donner cut. I know there's a lot of discussions about the Donner cut. Problem is, if you watch Superman the movie and the Donner cut back to back, they both have the same ending. I feel like if you're going to do the Donner cut right, well, then you needed to give the original ending to Superman the movie so you don't see the same ending twice. But anyway, I feel like if you just want to watch it in isolation, the Donner cut kicks butt. But I grew up watching the Richard Lester kind of recut version of Superman 2. And when I was a little kid, the only way you could see superheroes and supervillains fighting each other was to watch Superman 2. And luckily, HBO played it over and over and over again. And it's just fantastic. It was the first time I ever saw superpowered beings just beating the crap out of each other. And even though I'll never say that Superman 2 is even remotely on the same level as Superman the movie, when Terrence Stamp says, come to me, son of Jor-El, kneel before Zod.
Come to me, son of Jor-El! Kneel before Zod!
You believe it. And once again, going back to this idea of Christopher Reeve being polite, when he's standing on the flagpole outside the Daily Planet, says, General Zod, would you care to step outside? He's basically saying, come outside, I'm about to beat 7 shades of shit out of you, but he's still doing it in a polite fashion, which is, I think that's the essence of the character. Nobody will ever do it better than Christopher Reeve, even in a relatively kind of bad movie like Superman 3, which I saw in the theater. That was my first Superman I saw in the theater. Christopher Reeve is still good, even if the movie is kind of silly. But also at that time, I was such a big Richard Pryor fan. I didn't even really mind or notice that the movie was a subpar Superman movie because I had no real basis for comparison at that time. Because even when a Superman movie with Christopher Reeve is disappointing, you still have that sense of hopeful optimism and those universal themes. And I feel like that's a big thing that's missing from a lot of Superman interpretations is you got to find a way to have that hopeful optimism that can be relatable and inspiring to anybody that watches it. And Superman 3 was not a total loss because at least it led to some really funny jokes in Office Space in 1999 where they basically are explaining the scheme of theirs like that sounds familiar. Like, oh, it's the same thing as in Superman 3.
What this does is it takes those little remainders and puts it into account.
This sounds familiar.
Yeah, they did in Superman 3.
Right.
Yeah.
the whole movie of Superman 3 is worth being made just to get those jokes in Office Space. But also we get to watch Superman like taking shots and good Superman versus bad Superman and that freaky fucking robot from the end of the movie, which at that time when I saw it in the theater, absolutely petrified me. But the less said about Superman, the quest for peace, the better. But luckily now we're entering an era where I was becoming a comic book reader. So let's start with what I think are the very first comics that I ever owned featuring the character. And once again, it's hard to know like which comics belong to my brother versus me, but my dad would bring home comics from 7-Eleven, and I believe these are the first issues of Superman that I ever owned, which both came out in April of 1981. You have JLA 189 with a cover by Brian Bolland, written by Jerry Conway, and I was absolutely petrified by this comic back in the day. And it's one of the things that led me to love the Suicide Squad so intensely when Starro was put on the screen in such impactful fashion. But in the same month, we had Superman 358, where, not the world's most famous villain. Superman has a great rogues gallery, and he doesn't necessarily always get to fight his best villains on any given month. But I will say this, Superman, over his 87 years on this planet, I think he's a strong contender for having the best rogues gallery of any hero out there. Batman definitely has the best. But Spider-Man and Superman might be tied for second, or maybe the X-Men would be tied for second. There are a lot of people that are kind of tied for second, but I think Superman's rogues gallery is absolutely incredible. But then the following month, I had my first issue of DC Comics Presents, where Superman and Captain Marvel, a.k.a. Shazam, swapped powers, and that was my introduction to the character of Captain Marvel, which was kind of confusing back then because I never quite knew, is his name Shazam or is his name Captain Marvel, or in any case. But from the early 80s onward, for decades, I was a voracious reader of comics. But when you're a kid, it's hard to stick with a monthly book. Like, you either need a subscription or you need somebody to drive you to the comic shop or 7-Eleven. So a lot of my runs back then are interrupted by giant gaps. But there was a period that I got really excited about when I was a little kid that I'm just going to call the Superpowers era.
In the Battle of the Superpowers collection.
Because you had cartoons, action figures, and comics that were all trying to sell us these toys. And there was a lot of healthy competition at that time. I was more of a fan of G.I. Joe and Transformers and Masters of the Universe, where all these concepts, they'd have a comic, they'd have a cartoon, they'd have a toy line, and they were basically trying to gobble up as many of our dollars as possible. But I can vividly recall seeing an ad for Superpowers in the back, I think of an issue of Vigilante, where I was so obsessed with the idea of getting these toys. I sat there in my bed I kept thinking to myself, if I just will it into existence, the toys will just appear. I just thought that my mind was that powerful. If I just sat there and just said, like, they're going to appear, somehow magically they would just, anyway, my imagination was getting the better of me. But that was my introduction to the apocalyptic New Gods, which many years later, I would pick up all Jack Kirby's Fourth World Omnibus and I would read the original issues with Darkseid and Orion and all those great characters. But in the early 80s, if you picked up Superpowers Volume 1 or Superpowers Volume 2, which came out in 85, the following year, or you were watching Superfriends, the legendary superhero show, and or the Superpowers team, Galactic Guardians, you would see all this great characters from Apocalypse interacting with the Justice League. And so while it was technically not part of like official DC canon, this was my first exposure. It might have actually been my first exposure to Jack Kirby, period. I'm not quite sure when I went back and started reading reprints of like Fantastic Four and that sort of thing, but I've got a certain sentimental affection for the Superpowers era. We're getting into a period now that's going to get a little messy because I was getting older and I was collecting a lot of comics, and you had a lot of great writers and a lot of great artists all putting their fingerprints on Superman. And I'll do my best to kind of keep them all separate, but let's start with Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons, because I can vividly recall when my older brother came home from camp and he brought back Superman Annual number 11, the famous issue for the man who has everything, which has been adapted into animation and live action many times over. Never anywhere close to as good as the original issue. The cover date was of September, but for whatever reason, it came out in June. I must have read this comic 100 times. I've got a reprint now in this trade paperback. I've got my original bagged and boarded in my back room. But this is easily the Superman comic I've read the greatest number of times. And it's got it all. If someone were to say, you can go to a desert island and you can only take one comic written by Alan Moore, I wouldn't even hesitate. It would be Superman Annual number 11. It's so goddamn good, and it's such a simple concept where Mongol has basically decided to give Superman everything he could ever desire, and he has to give it up in order to defeat Mongol and save Batman, Wonder Woman, and the new Robin, Jason Todd. The art's incredible. And I remember my older brother kind of like walking me through and be like, this is a rated R comic. He didn't know what he was talking about. But it had Superman and Wonder Woman kiss. And at one point, Wonder Woman tells Mongol, like, go to hell. But it had certain ingredients that were kind of verboten in 1985. But it was an incredible time to be a young comic book fan, and that issue has become justifiably famous. But I feel like sometimes people overlook just how cool the story, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow, is, because, like I said before, it's Superman 423 and Action Comics 583, and every major Silver Age character has like a resolution to their storylines in that, and the most moving part by far is when Krypto decides to save Superman from the Kryptonite Man. And because he's a dog, he doesn't realize that the Kryptonite Man is poison to him, and so the dog is killing him as Krypto is dying. And it's some really heartbreaking stuff, but like the way Lex Luthor and Brainiac interact and how Brainiac basically just takes over his body involuntarily is absolutely horrifying. And there's some really sad stuff in there where Supergirl comes back in time with the Legion of Superheroes, and she doesn't know that at this time you have the Crisis on Infinite Earths where she famously is killed. And I'll get to that in a second, because once again, too many comics coming out at this time to talk about them all completely, totally sequentially. But the scene where Supergirl's wondering, hey, well, where's my my present day version of myself? Did I turn into a beautiful woman? And everybody's kind of tap dancing around the idea of not telling her that she has been killed at this time. It's really powerful stuff. So if you love your old school Superman, definitely give that issue or those two issues a go. But I mentioned Crisis on Infinite Earths. Right around this time, we also have some stuff by John Byrne and Frank Miller. But let's talk about Marv Wolfman and the Crisis on Infinite Earths, which ran from 1985 to 1986. And it's one of the all-time great kind of maxi series. And a lot of people believe this is what brought the Bronze Age to an end. And the modern age of comics began shortly thereafter. But you got George Perez, and you've got Marv Wolfman, and you have this incredible modern cover where you've got George Perez pencils painted over by Alex Ross. But more on Alex Ross in a sec. And speaking of that gorgeous cover by George Perez and Alex Ross, I have it right here in this trade paperback of Crisis on Infinite Earths. But the cover goes all the way around to the back. It is awesome. I mean, it's one of those covers with so much detail. You kind of need like a magnifying glass to go into it to appreciate all the little details. But it is true. I mean, if you could make a case for what is the greatest piece of comic book art ever created in the history of comics, maybe it would be the cover for this trade paperback. But everything that Secret Wars did for Marvel Comics at this time was accomplished by Crisis on Infinite Earths, where all the major characters got great story arcs. We had the death of the Flash, we had the death of Supergirl. We had all these incredible story beats, awesome art. Maybe one too many characters to keep track of, and all the various spin-offs and tie-ins and that sort of thing. But if you want to know, like, what is the greatest company-wide crossover of the 1980s at DC, no question, hands down, Crisis on Infinite Earths. And they've been kind of replicating it and redoing it ever since. This is as wild and insane and deranged as DC Comics gets, and it's well worth reading many times over. And shortly after this is when the John Byrne era begins, but we got to tie up a few loose ends first, because at the same time as the Crisis, we also had Frank Miller doing his Dark Knight Returns, a limited series of 4 issues from February to June of 1986. And while Superman's not the star of it, he is a major featured character where you basically see Superman, fighting the Cold War on behalf of Ronald Reagan and getting hit by a nuclear weapon at one point, which obviously got reused by Zack Snyder in Batman v Superman. And we get the famous Batman versus Superman brawl, where Batman, with the help of Green Arrow, with a little kryptonite arrow, does manage for a few short seconds to get the better of Super Duperman. And there's some great little Superman beats, like at one point during Bruce Wayne's funeral, and he's used some chemicals to kind of bring himself back to life, when his heartbeat starts coming back, and Superman looks over at Robin, and she's like, oh! And Superman just winks because he knows his best friend, but sadly now an enemy, is coming back to life. Those are some really great moments. And so even though this is a video about Superman stories instead of Batman stories, in the canon of great Superman stories, the Dark Knight Returns will always be one of the main feature attractions. And speaking of Frank Miller's legendary story, this is my original trade paperback collecting all 4 issues that I've had in my possession since I was like 11 years old. I had a few of the individual issues, but I was kind of late to the party on it. But as soon as this bad boy came out, I picked it up, and I've read it I don't know how many times. I'm amazed this thing still has a spine, but it's been well loved and well cared for in the decades since. Now, I know I keep talking about getting into the modern age of comics, which has lasted like 40 years at this point, but let's pause and have a quick break to discuss some video games. And the really good Superman video games, we can discuss them later on. But the first Superman video game that I got exposed to, but I barely played it, was Superman for the Atari in 1979. A little rudimentary, a little basic, and I was never a big Atari guy. I played Intellivision, ColecoVision, arcade games, then eventually Nintendo. But the Nintendo game of Superman from 1987, played it a bit. It's also a little clunky, but the game that I loved was the 1988 arcade game where you could play two-player, and the other character kind of looked like Captain Marvel, aka Shazam, but he really was just Red Superman. But it was fucking badass, and you could fly and use heat vision and beat the crap out of people. It was a pretty good representation of the character. And then at home, the first really good one in my opinion, was the 1992 game for the Sega Genesis. Friend of mine had, and I would basically just watch him play. I barely got any playtime myself on it, but it's a pretty badass early 90s game. And the early 90s, when games started to level up and evolve very, very quickly. And so just as a way of kind of a palate cleanser, I just wanted to show you all a few clips from these games before we dive into John Byrne and Man of Steel #1 and 1986, the beginning of the post-crisis Superman. So for anybody who was a massive comic book fan in the 1980s, it was impossible to ignore the contributions of John Byrne. He was prolific. And when he was at Marvel in the early 80s, he was working on X-Men with Chris Claremont. And he was working on Fantastic Four, and he was working on Alpha Flight. But his output was considerable. But he was brought over to DC to reboot the Man of Steel after the crisis. And he didn't stay on the character for that long, for a couple years. One of the most traumatizing, but also like a kind of arousing and confusing moments of my childhood came at the end of his run with Superman 22 in 1988, where Superman's forced to make a pretty fateful decision about the Kryptonian criminals who were placed in the Phantom Zone by Jor-El in the Pocket Universe a long time ago, and Superman decides to kill them all with green kryptonite. He's already depowered them with gold kryptonite, but they're still Kryptonian. And there's something about the way as they're dying, the character, I'm not sure if I'm saying her name correctly, but Zaora. But in any case, the girl of the three Kryptonian criminals, the way she's offering Superman, I'll be your slave and I'll show you these things. And I mean, at age 12, I was like, holy shit, like what the fuck is going on here? It was so hardcore. Just the idea of Superman executing these people that were like basically variations on the characters that I was familiar with from the Superman 2 movie, which I'd watched a million times over at that point. This was the end of the John Byrne run, and that issue has been incredibly controversial ever since. But holy crap, if you're going to wrap up a run in a memorable way, having Superman put on the Executioner's mask on the cover and execute 3 Kryptonians, that's a pretty hardcore way to leave an impression. But another legend from this period is Jerry Ordway, who left his fingerprints all over the character. He worked with Marv Wolfman, and sometimes he would just work as a writer-artist the same way as John Byrne. But he worked on a ton of Superman titles from the late 80s through 1993, which leads me to perhaps the most famous Superman storyline in the history of comics, because one of these issues sold 23 million copies. Without me saying what I'm about to talk about next, if you were to guess which issue of Superman sold the greatest number of issues in the 1990s, I don't know about the early days. It would be Superman 75, which had a famous black plastic cover with the Superman S in red bleeding. But I've never opened it, and I didn't need to open it because I had the Death of Superman trade paperback, which I read many times. The reflection of my lights are not working all that well, but I've read this many times over, and it's awesome. And what's interesting about the Death of Superman is that you have the story unfolding across multiple titles. So you have a lot of writers and a lot of artists all basically like kind of passing the baton, like introducing Doomsday and introducing the various characters that are going to get their asses kicked by him. And then slowly but surely you build up to Superman 75, where every single page in the book was a big giant splash page. There were no panels. It was just either like a 1-page splash page or a 2-page splash page every step of the way. And it was, maybe simplistic. Let's just make a big strong guy fight Superman until they both die. But it was dramatic and it was powerful. And that moment where he falls back and Lois Lane is, reacting in horror, it really got under my skin. And at this time, Marvel was doing well, and all the X titles were selling like crazy. And you, of course, had Image Comics at this time, selling with like Spawn and Youngblood and everything. But DC had been kind of left out of like the big early collector's craze of the early 90s. Although The Killing Joke in the late 80s had been absolutely a huge part of that collector's craze. But suddenly with the death of Superman, DC Comics were selling better than anybody else, and it was just absolutely fucking fantastic. And at that time, I started reading and buying more DC than I had in a very long time, which led right into the Reign of the Supermen, which is a really cool series of issues where they were introducing all these characters that might be Superman returning, like Steel, or the Cyborg Superman, or the new Superboy. But you had 4 characters where it's like, is this Kal-El or is it not? And as it turns out, none of them is Kal-El, but there were some really good storylines in there, like when Mongol and Cyborg Superman just basically completely, totally annihilate all of Coast City, and you start seeing the beginning of Hal Jordan going crazy. And of course, this was the period where Superman started rocking out a mullet. I don't know why they thought it was a good idea to give Superman a mullet in the early 90s, but they did. And it looks just as ugly now as it did back then. But anytime you're looking at comics, if Superman's rocking out a mullet, you're like, oh yeah, this is probably from like the early mid 90s. But that was just the fad at that time. And I had the entire Reign story arc collected in this great giant trade paperback called The Return of Superman. Somehow I've misplaced it, or I could not find it for this video to show it off. But I read that bad boy many times over. And these stories were so popular. In 2007, The Death of Superman was adapted as animation. And in 2018, they did both The Death and The Return of Superman. But the names of the specific animated movies were called, hang on, Superman Doomsday in 2007, and then in 2018 you had Death of Superman followed by Reign of the Supermen, and I believe actually Death of Superman and Reign of the Superman, they released it as like a kind of a limited release theatrical movie where they put both the movies together, and I got to see it in the theater with all the big giant comic book dorks. But that was good fun. But more on those Warner Brothers animated movies in a bit. We'll get to all of them at the end of the video. But when I think back to the mullet era of Superman, I can forgive the mullet era of Superman because part of that era was included in Grant Morrison's legendary run on JLA. I went for a long time. Every once in a while, Mark Waid would step in and handle some duties, but here's the beginning of the run. But these are all the trade paperbacks which collect the entire Grant Morrison JLA run, which is all 100% worth reading, even when he's not necessarily writing every single individual issue, but it's all the great Grant Morrison era, and it fucking rules. And toward the end of his run, he gave us JLA Earth 2, drawn by Frank Quitely, which is just awesome. If you just want to read a great standalone storyline of the JLA written by Grant Morrison, this one will absolutely get it done. But this, the New World Order, the first couple issues, I've read it more times than I probably should admit. I really enjoy it, where you basically have the white Martians coming in and pretending to be superheroes and saving the world before everybody realizes, oh, these guys are actually really, really bad people. And it's some of the best writing for Batman. It's some of the best writing for Wally West and Kyle Rayner, who were the Flash and Green Lantern at the time. It's fantastic. And I did have the privilege of meeting Grant Morrison at one point. It was Comic-Con 2015, I believe. Hang on, let me just double check. Yeah, Comic-Con 2015, and as we were posing, he looked at me and said, "We look like 2 eggs boiling in a pot." I wish I could do a Scottish accent, but I can't. But it was a huge honor getting to meet Grant Morrison, because between his run on New X-Men and a million other comics, Batman, whatever, I've been a big fan of Grant Morrison for many, many years. But his JLA run is absolutely Hall of Fame, as is JLA Earth 2 in 2000. But the storyline that he's probably most famous for now is a huge source of inspiration for James Gunn with his version of Superman. It's not an adaptation, but All-Star Superman, which ran from 2006 to 2008, and then was adapted as animation in 2011. If you like all the weird shit that went down in the Silver Age, the same way Alan Moore kind of wrapped it all up in the mid-'80s, Grant Morrison kind of digs it all back up in 2006 to 2008, and it's just killer. Whether you like Bizarro or Jimmy Olsen or any of these characters that were so popular back then, Grant Morrison really delivers all those characters and scenarios in his signature style. It's one of the best versions of Supes, one of the best versions of Lois. Crypto's in there. Obviously, Lex Luthor plays a huge role as well. It's absolutely fantastic. And if someone were to say, I could only read one Superman story ever, And they're young, like not like some of my age. Like if they're my age, I would just say, yeah, read Superman Annual number 11. But like just recently, I gave the entire collected edition of All-Star Superman to my 9-year-old nephew, saying, look, if you see the movie, this is going to be, it's kind of stylistically what has informed the movie. So if you like it, you might like the comic, but that might be an excellent place to start. But Grant Morrison, he can be a little bit narratively complex. So sometimes he makes it hard to be the gateway drug into comics. But once you're into comics, Grant Morrison's one of the greats. And speaking of narrative complexity, he also gave us Final Crisis from 2008 to 2009, which doesn't completely work for me, but when it works great. And it has a great shot with Superman and Batman's dead body after Darkseid kills Batman. I mean, Batman obviously came back, but it led to Grant Morrison getting to do that incredible story arc where Dick Grayson and young Damian took over as Batman and Robin for a while because Batman had died in Final Crisis. But Superman plays a big part in it. Is really, really good. But yeah, Grant Morrison, basically from 1996 to 2009, his fingerprints were all over Superman. He's one of the greats, but now, because I've talked about all the Grant Morrison stuff, remember I mentioned earlier about how this is going to be like ironing a shirt, but you have to kind of go back. We got to go back to 1996. Because that's the time where Mark Waid and Alex Ross gave us Kingdom Come 1, 2, 3, and 4 between May and August of 1996. And this is one of those trades that I've read many, many, many times because it's awesome. And people get tired of hearing people talk about Kingdom Come because it's been celebrated to death. But I was rereading it last night. It's fucking great. And Superman is absolutely the central protagonist of the story. I mean, Wonder Woman's huge in it. Batman's huge in it. There are a lot of different characters that get to occupy center stage. But there's no question, this is Mark Waid's primal scream against early mid-90s comics where suddenly everybody had knives and guns and pouches, and it was like characters like Cable and Deadpool and like all these kind of Rob Liefeld characters were dominating the industry. And Mark Waid, you could tell, wasn't into it and wanted to do an Elseworlds kind of dystopian scenario where Superman comes out of retirement to put all these psychos in their place and tries to prevent Ragnarok or Judgment Day from happening. And it all leads up to some of the most iconic shit I've ever read in comics. And it helps that at this time, Alex Ross was really entering his prime. I mean, some people prefer his run on Marvels with Kurt Busiek, and Alex Ross has obviously done a million great covers since then. He's one of the great comic book artists of the last 30, 40 years. But when it comes to narrative storytelling, I don't know if he was ever better than in Kingdom Come. I don't know if Mark Waid was ever better than in Kingdom Come. And just seeing Superman kind of lecturing the next generation about like this is not the way, and not being a bunch of just murderous thugs and alcoholics. But it's not like he gets to just kind of have his way, because there are a lot of people who don't see eye to eye with him, like Green Arrow and Batman. And when it all leads up to this giant battle where Superman's doing everything in his power to try to stem the loss of life as all these supervillains are breaking out of this giant gulag that they've created. And the only thing that's keeping them from participating in the battle is the fact that Captain Marvel has shown up under the influence of Lex Luthor, and they're having just this knockdown, drag-out brawl, battle to the death of these two giant titans where Superman can't do anything other than be fully occupied. It's just absolutely glorious. So if you've not read Kingdom Come ever or in a long time, revisit it and it'll absolutely blow your goddamn mind. Speaking of blowing our minds, the late 90s, we truly just had an embarrassment of riches when it came to the character of Superman, because at this time, Bruce Timm was starting to shift from Batman over to Superman. The Batman animated series had been this giant hit in the 90s, and starting in 1996, I mean, once again, 1996 had Grant Morrison, Alex Ross, and Bruce Timm all working on the character of Superman. But from 96 to 2000, he gave us the animated series where Tim Daly got to do the voice of Superman, and Clancy Brown as Lex. Clancy Brown's one of the all-time great Lex Luthors. But what was killer about this series, as great as it was, and it had great episodes with Darkseid and Brainiac, and all the continuity of Batman the Animated Series and The Adventures of Superman was carried over and continued in Justice League, which was 52 episodes between 2000 and 2004, where George Newbern took over as Superman, which led directly into Justice League Unlimited, which ran for 39 episodes from 2004 to 2006. So basically, from 1996 to 2006, if you're interested in the character of Superman, that's a total of more than 100 episodes of very high quality storytelling, where what was great about the Bruce Timm era on all those shows, the writers and the directors, they knew their comics. They were doing the best they could to adapt some of their favorite story arcs. And Superman is featured prominently in front and center in almost all of Justice League, and Justice League Unlimited has some of his best moments, especially in the very last episode, the series finale, where he just gets to throw down with Darkseid and show him just how powerful he truly is.
But you can take it, can't you, big man? What we have here is a rare opportunity for me to cut loose and show you just how powerful I really am.
It's just absolutely phenomenal. You could do a 3-hour video just talking about the greatness of that era, but I think what's missing today with a lot of superhero adaptations is they have a lot of writers and directors who don't know a fucking thing about comics. But in the Bruce Timm era, across those seasons, you had just an absolute murderer's row of storytellers and artists that were bringing the best stories of DC to life in signature style, and I think they will continue to shine a little brighter with each passing year. So Bruce Timm, I love him for a lot of reasons, but what he gave us in animation from Batman the Animated Series through Justice League Unlimited, I think we'll be in his debt for a very, very long time. But we're now officially in the 21st century where my appetite for comics increased considerably because I had more buying power. I was working and actually had disposable income. And suddenly in the early 2000s, both Marvel and DC, seeing how the movies were starting to catch on, they started really putting their best foot forward with some of the best storytellers in the history of the biz. I would argue from like the early 2000s up through about 2015, 2016, DC and Marvel gave us a lot of reasons to continue reading comics, and I was spending between like $50 and $100 per week at the comic shop. And in the early 2000s, there was no writer that was more of a celebrity in comics than Mark Millar. And his name is not Mark Millar. Everybody always, because he's got an A in his name, everybody calls him Millar. He's from Scotland. It's just Mark Millar. Just say it with the Scottish accent, Mark Millar. But he's been obsessed with Superman for a long time, and he dabbled with the character over the years. And the 1978 movie, Superman the Movie, is his favorite movie of all time. But in 2003, he gave us Red Sun. It ran only for 3 issues, but it imagines the perfect what-if scenario. What if Superman landed in Soviet Russia as opposed to Smallville? And that's the jumping off point. And of course, if Superman lands in Soviet Russia, he can still grow up as like a farm boy, and he can still grow up trying to be a man of the people, but it's going to be quite a different interpretation of the character. So we get a different version of Batman and a different version of Wonder Woman and a different version of Lex Luthor, because Lex Luthor is basically the American answer to how do we destroy the most powerful man alive, who is the greatest weapon for our enemies. And they tried turning it into a cartoon in 2020, and the first scene was so annoying and so awful, I had to turn it off. I was like, ugh, no. I'll just go back and reread the comic, and the comic is 100% worth reading. So even though I prefer some of Mark Millar's other stuff like The Ultimates, but here we are in 2025, he's still writing comics and developing shows, and he's probably enjoyed more success as a comic book writer getting his ideas turned into movies than any other comic book writer alive, where like Kingsman the Secret Service, that comes from Mark Millar. Kick-Ass, that comes from Mark Millar. Some of the best versions of the characters we've seen are like interpretations like that come from some of the comics that he's written, like Civil War. We would not have Captain America Civil War without Mark Millar. So he's a true legend, but if you want to see him tackling Superman and all of his glory and during his early prime, definitely check out Superman Red Sun and pretend like the cartoon was never made, or at least based on the first 5 or 10 minutes. I don't know if the rest of the movie gets good, but I fucking hated the opening. But Mark Millar was by no means alone in doing incredible stuff with the character of Superman in the early 2000s. We had Kurt Busiek writing his 4-issue limited series Secret Identity, which started in 2004. That's fantastic. One of my favorites from this period. It's a little cheesy, but it's real fucking fun. Jeph Loeb's Superman/Batman, which he wrote from 2003 to 2006. He ended his run with issue 26. And he would work with different artists like Michael Turner or Carlos Pacheco, but my favorite was always Ed McGuinness. Ed McGuinness and Jeph Loeb. Every once in a while you'll find writers and artists where their sensibilities are just a perfect match. But he started with the Public Enemy's arc, which was turned into a pretty good animated movie in 2009. And that's probably the best version we'll ever see of the animated version of Power Girl, rocking out those massive tatas. And they did a Superman Batman Apocalypse in 2010, but I loved this entire run by Jeph Loeb. And Jeph Loeb is more of a TV guy these days, and he was largely like the architect for a lot of the big early Marvel shows on Netflix. But he got to start writing things like Teen Wolf and Commando. I mean, he's a big movie writer who switched over into being a comic book writer, and he was one of my favorite comic book writers at that time. But Superman Batman was just an absolute blast, and I wish it had gone more than 26 issues. And a little after this, Geoff Johns started dabbling with the character. He had made a name for himself working for Richard Donner early on, And he also wrote The Flash for a while, and he worked on Justice Society for a while. But on Infinite Crisis in 2005, he became one of the big kind of celebrity writers at DC for a while. And after Infinite Crisis, which went from 2005 to 2006, he went on Action Comics, and then eventually, much later, and much to our chagrin, the New 52 and the Justice League reboot in 2011, which led to Superman getting that ridiculous collar and losing his red underwear. How dare you take off Superman's red underwear without his permission? But in the late aughts, when Geoff Johns was writing Action Comics, we got some really cool stuff because he worked with Gary Frank on some really cool Action Comics story arcs, like Action Comics 858 to 863, as well as probably my favorite that they did, the Brainiac arc they did from 866 to 870. But we also had Jim Lee kicking ass on Superman with Brian Azzarello. And I always thought that Brian Azzarello was a weird fit for Superman. I much prefer him when he's doing stuff like Hellblazer or 100 Bullets. I mean, Brian Azzarello is fucking killer, but he's better with much edgier, more graphic material. But Jim Lee, obviously, everybody loved him when he was on X-Men and Wildcats in the 90s, and he made a big kind of resurgence in the early 2000s, drawing Batman for Jeph Loeb. But through Superman with Azzarello, Jim Lee did give us some awesome covers with Superman, and I love the issue where you basically have like a mirror image where Superman's in the exact same pose but in the daytime versus Batman in the darkness on the earlier book that Jim Lee had drawn. But I just want to say one final thing about Jim Lee and his handling of the character. I think it's unforgivable that they redesigned his costume to remove the red trunks and add that silly little collar. Like, nobody's ever complained about Superman having the red underwear at any point in the character's history. And there's something about how if you take the red trunks away, he looks kind of naked. It's like you see his package too much in the absence of the red trunks. And I like that they brought the red trunks back for this latest version of the character with James Gunn. But it's annoying that they've given him that little collar. And some say, oh, it's Kryptonian armor. It just looks ridiculous. I like the low neckline and the cape and all that stuff. Call me old school, call me stubborn, call me whatever you like, but Jim Lee deserves not the lion's share, but a big chunk of the blame when it comes to the kind of loathsome redesign of Superman's costume. And I just feel like eventually at a certain point, the Superman costume was more or less perfected by people like John Byrne, and why mess with perfection? But with so many great Superman comics being written at this time and so much great Superman animation through Bruce Timm, sometimes people forget that there was a Superman live-action movie which came out in 2006, Superman Returns. The first time I saw that trailer, I thought it was going to be a $1 billion movie. I thought it was going to be the greatest superhero movie ever made. Like that first trailer where they're just using Marlon Brando's narration from the original movie, as well as that John Williams theme from the introduction of Krypton. I was like, Jesus Christ. And remember, Bryan Singer was coming off of X2 at this time. I thought the sky was the limit. The movie never quite worked for me. Saw it in the theater, and I was like, huh. But like Kevin Spacey as Lex, and like the tone, and Brandon Routh as Superman, it all just seemed kind of awkward and forced and weird, and I never feel the urge or the compulsion to go back and rewatch that movie. Perhaps it has its fans and defenders. I know that Robert Meyer Burnett feels like there's a longer cut, which would have made a more favorable impression. But yeah, they missed their window with Superman Returns to revive the character. But we would not have to wait long before Zack Snyder would get a turn with the character a few years later. But between Superman Returns and Zack Snyder taking a crack at him with Henry Cavill, we had one of the best versions of Superman that I've ever seen. And it was directed by Tim Miller. The guy who directed Deadpool. It's not a movie, but it's a long, lengthy intro/trailer to the game DC Universe Online in 2011.
Bring him to me!
I quit the game pretty quickly. It was an MMO RPG with superheroes, and I was just so addicted to World of Warcraft, I couldn't get into yet another MMO at that time. But that teaser for the game, which turned into the intro for the game, I mean, I watched it over and over and over, and basically you see an alternative scenario of what would happen if Lex Luthor won. What would happen if Lex Luthor killed the Justice League and killed Superman right before Brainiac invaded? And suddenly he's like, oh, this invasion would be easier to repel if I hadn't killed all the superheroes. But that's some really fun, cool animation, and I can still watch it in 2025 anytime. but we have finally arrived at the Henry Cavill era with Man of Steel in 2013, and I know there are a lot of people out there who, like, this is their only version of Superman they care about. I hope everything I've talked about earlier in this video has proven that there are a lot of interpretations of the character to be enjoyed, but I get it. I mean, Henry Cavill, he's a big, muscular badass, and I enjoyed him. I don't like him as much as Christopher Reeve or as much as the Fleischer Brothers version, but that Man of Steel trailer, the third trailer, it's one of the greatest trailers of the 21st century. It just, like, the music, like, everything about it came together perfectly. I think that trailer almost oversells the movie, because one of my most lingering complaints about Zack Snyder is that when it comes to his look and his aesthetic and, like, what he can do in terms of action is second to none, but he always struggles with working with great writers. And I think, like, the final third of Man of Steel, where you have the Kryptonians trying to convert Earth's atmosphere back into an atmosphere where they would essentially be depowered, that's never made any sense to me. It's like, why do you need to turn into Krypton? Y'all are all now gods flying around, totally impervious to harm. Why would you want to change Earth into Krypton? Like, that doesn't make any sense. And Batman vs. Superman has some of the best scenes in the history of DC, but also that screenplay is just vomit. It's all over the place, but it has these moments where I think the closest we've ever come to seeing, like, what would it look like if Olympian gods were to come down and have battles on planet Earth when Wonder Woman and Superman are fighting Doomsday, and he's exploding with all that, like, great Jack Kirby crackle, even though Kirby never worked on Doomsday, but that's the Kirby crackle we're seeing, and you're seeing Superman and Wonder Woman in silhouette as the energy's going over them. No filmmaker has ever given us anything like that. So I don't sleep on Zack Snyder's contributions to what he gave us, because he really gets in his DNA and in his bones what are some of the best aspects of superhero combat. And like I was mentioning much earlier in the video when discussing the Fleischer animation, Zack Snyder also understands Superman needs to be graceful from time to time to be in contrast to when he is brutal, like when he shows up in the Snyder Cut.
Not impressed.
And he blocks Steppenwolf's axe on his shoulder, and then he gently and slowly and gracefully blows his breath up the axe before breaking it, and then he like does that huge, powerful kick. It's that contrast. It's the slow, graceful blow followed by the kick that makes him seem so cool. Or the first time we see him fighting Doomsday in Batman v Superman, when Doomsday is about to kill Lex Luthor, and Superman flies up and catches the fist. Zack Snyder, he gets it. Like, there are many things he doesn't get, like the written word and complete sentences, but when it comes to images and emotion and that high intensity visceral style, he's got some extraordinary qualities. He has given us images and scenes of Superman unlike anything we've ever seen before or since. So for that, I don't disparage Zack Snyder's contributions. I just wish he would work with better writers, and if he'd worked with better writers, I think those would be potentially the greatest DC movies ever made. And I still get so many chills and goosebumps from so many great sequences featuring Henry Cavill. So I know a lot of people felt like he was kind of done dirty by James Gunn and kind of unfairly dismissed, and some of James Gunn's friends got to stick around, and Henry Cavill could have easily played this character for another 5 to 10 years, and I agree. And he got screwed on The Witcher as well. Henry Cavill's been screwed by a lot of productions going the wrong way. But luckily he did get 3 movies, and they are imperfect, but with awesome scenes. And I think Henry Cavill will be remembered for a long time. It's not the greatest version of Superman, but a pretty fucking cool one that I love dearly. But while Zack Snyder was doing his thing with DC and getting his work butchered and recut and reshot, and then, like, the less said about how the DC universe ultimately kind of like came unspooled and unraveled, the better. But at the same time, you had some really cool video games being made featuring the character, and the 2 most prominent are probably Injustice: Gods Among Us from 2013, followed by Injustice 2 in 2017. They're both created by NetherRealm Studios. I played both a bit, but I've watched all the cutscenes. I enjoyed Injustice 2 more. The graphics were a little better, and the finishing moves were just so fucking cool. Thoroughly enjoyed playing it. Did some online matches and that sort of thing. But what's great about Injustice is that we get to see what would happen if Joker, of all people, took Superman to the breaking point, where he basically became a totalitarian dictator, ruling the world like with an iron fist, as opposed to a benevolent person who saves people. Instead, he would command people. And then we get a great continuation to that story with Injustice 2. And what's cool about the game is how there's a crucial point toward the end of the game where you can change the ending depending upon if you're going to side with Batman for the final battle or Superman in the final battle, and that changes which ending you're going to see. And even though we've never had a great epic movie featuring Brainiac as the main antagonist, Injustice 2 is the closest we've come yet, where everything you love and adore about Brainiac, no matter which version you prefer, whether you like him as like the robotic version or the green guy with the little dots on his head, you get to see kind of a hybrid of the two in this game. But it's like, what would happen if all these formerly good heroes who have gone bad and the heroes who have remained good were forced to team up to fight a common foe, and then eventually, once that foe's been defeated, how would they resolve their lingering differences? And let's just say, if you're Batman, good thing he's got that gold kryptonite knife to reduce Superman's power. But if you're more of an evil Superman guy, well, then you get to put Batman finally in his place. But yeah, Injustice: Gods Among Us and Injustice 2 kick much ass, especially if you like. There are plenty of people out there who just ignore film and television entirely and just play games. So if you just play games and you want a great Superman experience, well, then those games are screaming your name. But we are coming to the end of our journey, but we have one final stop to make: the world of DC Universe animated original movies from 2007 to the present. I stopped watching these a couple years ago, but from 2007 through about 2020 or 2021, I watched a ton of them, and Superman is featured front and center in a lot of them. So I just wanted to give a shout out to some of the highlights from this great heyday, because what was cool is how at this time when these animated movies were being made, they would use the comics as like an idea factory, and then the best storylines would get adapted into feature films, and they would maintain some continuity, and sometimes they'd reboot and start a new continuity, but you could watch them all in a row and have this big giant animated story. And it's a shame that that's all kind of fallen to pieces. But just going in sequential order, the ones that I like where Superman is prominently featured. And I should also say that Sam Liu, he's the director of a lot of these. And I've always liked his work. Not always, but he's still active. He worked on Creature Commandos for James Gunn recently. But he directed a lot of these. But we have Superman Doomsday, Justice League The New Frontier, Justice League Crisis on Two Earths, and its sequel, Justice League Doom, Superman Batman Public Enemies, which I mentioned before, and Superman Batman Apocalypse. Batman The Dark Knight Returns, more of a Batman movie, but Superman does show up. Justice League The Flashpoint Paradox, followed by the reboot with Justice League War, Justice League Gods and Monsters, The Death of Superman, followed by Reign of the Supermen, Justice League Dark Apocalypse War from 2020, which is one of my personal favorites, where we get to see Superman getting kryptonite tattooed into his body, and then later being possessed by Trigon and duking it out with Darkseid. It's awesome. And then after that reboot, where we basically see the entire DC universe get murdered, I mean, it's awesome. It's one of my favorites that they ever did. Then we see Superman Man of Tomorrow, which is pretty goddamn good. I reviewed it on this channel, but then I've started drifting away from DC Universe animated movies. All right, we've reached the end of the video. I talked for a little longer than I thought I was going to talk. I've got nearly 2 hours of video that I need to try and edit down and condense. My voice is starting to fade. My energy is starting to fade. It's time to wrap this sucker up. I hope you enjoyed this journey through the history of the character. And no matter what we see next week, whether it's good, bad, mediocre, or a mix of all the above, I just hope that people will continue to go back and look at some of the best examples of Superman. He's a fascinating character, and what's hilarious is how I've never even considered him to be one of my favorite superhero characters. There are many other characters I would rank much higher, but I've spent a lot of time reading about and watching and playing and enjoying his adventures over the year, and it's just because there have been so many incredible artists and storytellers that have been associated with the character. But let me know what you think are some of the best arcs or interpretations of the character down below. What did I overlook? What did I omit? And if you're going to give me recommendations, just remember, mention like which volume of the stories you're talking about, like which issue, which year, which creators, just to make it a little bit easier to find those versions of the story. But looking forward to tackling Superman next week, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.